Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's APM webinar, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, from Osita Madu, Senior EDI Manager from HS2 Limited. I'm Robert Allen, and I'm the APM Branches Manager, and it's great to see so many people join us today. I hope this finds you well. You'll find yourselves on mute mode, but we're keen for your interaction, so please feel free to submit any questions you may have via your main control panel, and dependent on time, I'll read these out to Osita at the end. I would personally like to say thank you to all the volunteers of the APM branches and the APM SIGs for all their efforts with their volunteering and these webinars to date. So, Osita is a CIPD qualified human resource professional with over 18 years experience spent specialising in employee relations, recruitment, training and diversity and inclusion. So on that note, I'll pass over to Osita. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Robert, and for the introduction. And I really want to use the hour that we have, most of which will be spent me talking to you for about 35 to 40 minutes of that time on the various sort of areas within equality diversity at HS2. There will certainly be an opportunity towards the end, 20 minutes or so, for questions from any of those listening in on to this webinar. And apologies that I'm not visible to you all, but you can certainly hear my voice, and there'll be opportunity further down to just talk a bit really about what comes out from today's session. So what am I going to cover? Basically, I will go through to talk about why equality, diversity and inclusion matters to HS2, and also the sort of different work stream we have on this topic. What good looks like, what's an example of good? We can talk about that. How we measure and report success, what the success looks like and how we report that, and the challenges for the year ahead, and some of which we're working through, and some will be on the horizon for the new financial year. Robert, if I can just go to the first slide, please. Thank you. And you have in front of you really this sort of overview that is a statement from our Chief Exec Officer, Mark Thurston, and it talks about equality and diversity and how critical it is to our success and to HS2. And on reading it, you'll see there are different components to that. Equality, diversity and inclusion is critical both to our success, and it's certainly taken serious not just by our CEO, it's also taken very seriously by our executive board and the senior leadership team. It's something which is embedded as part of our values. So when we have values moment at every meeting, we sort of highlight anything pertinent that people want to share before we start meetings. It's also something on their radar. So when it comes to reporting, particularly any decisions around diversity, and that might have implication both in terms of our workforce, across our supply chain, in our communities and other areas, diversity is woven into all those aspects of the work we do. And so for us, it's important that we've set the challenge for our suppliers who are awarded the HS2 contract. And some of those I will explain a bit later on what that looks like. But in essence, we have commitments, contractual commitments that our suppliers have to deliver. And those requirements go beyond the legal requirements. There are things to do with service delivery and looking at the impact on different users of the service. There is also the element within that around undertaking equality analysis. So some of the other challenge is we have an equality analysis. Some of you may understand this to be impact assessment, depending where in the sector you work. But in essence, what it helps us to do is to identify where the risks are and to what particular groups these risks are to, how we are able to minimize the risk or reduce the risk, and in some cases, how we eliminate those risks. And some of the risks could be things that may be detrimental to particular groups because it provides more discrimination or reduces the ability for them to participate. And so we do our best to remove that. And just to share with you one example of that, we had undergone a restructure last financial year, so up till March 2020. we'd undergone a restructure across HS2, and it meant that there were a number of roles that were made redundant and people that were made redundant as a result of that. What it then meant is that we had to, from the outset, make sure that there wasn't any disproportionate impact on particularly women, those with disability, those from particular ethnic minority groups, those from LGBT communities, etc. And that was important because we didn't want a situation where, as part of the restructure, there were a large number of those groups that were impacted and then consequently leave the organization. And there are tools and methods by which we do that. So it matters for this reason. And if we go on to the next slide, please, Robert, and talk a bit about other elements of why it matters that links in to what the CEO statements states. So we recognize that equality, diversity, and inclusion offers us one of the ways that we provide solution to attract those diverse skills and talent into our sector. So if there isn't any way by which we actually recognize talent, we certainly need to think about the type of talent we want to come into work at HS2. And there won't be typically those who come from an engineering background. There won't be typically those who are qualified to a certain degree within engineering and construction. So it's about actually looking at where the talent exists, how diverse the talent is, and where outside of the sector we can attract them. So it certainly provides us a way to attract diverse talent into the sector. There is a contractual obligation. So what we ask our suppliers to deliver and what we set out in our works information, which is part of our tender documents, sets out very clearly the areas that we would want our suppliers to be able to deliver over the lifetime of their contract. And I guess the part that most people associate equality and diversity with is around legal compliance. You're well aware, certainly within the public sector, there is Equality Act 2010, which has been in place. And part of that Equality Act, there is a public sector equality duty in section 149, which really sets out very clearly that as part of any advancement of opportunity in terms of removing discrimination, that we have a duty in our service provision, in our employment practice, and work with the community to mitigate and address equality. So there is a legal compliance by which we do this, and again, that's something we have to continue to fulfill. Perhaps for me, and certainly for the organization, is that the HS2 program will come to an end. And when I say come to an end, once we've completed the build and then going into operation, there'll be a different company that will take over to operate the railway. Part of that legacy, once we've finished building HS2, is to know that actually we've delivered something that's fit for purpose, so that it's accessible to the widest pool of people, regardless of their barriers to disability and inclusion as well. And that is really key for us, because if what we've delivered at the end of the program is not fit for purpose, then there's no point of all the work we've done so far, because that's really the litmus test for us. And certainly we want to be able to leave the infrastructure, rail and construction sector a lot more diverse than what it is currently. And so the need to attract and recruit and retain diverse people into the sector is going to be a key part of our legacy. And we certainly want to be able to also share the best practice examples that we've developed over the years on the HS2 program. And some of which would be around how much business we've done with minority-owned suppliers. So whether those suppliers are women-owned, whether those are disabled-owned suppliers who would work with HS2, it's good to know that the amount of money we spent on this program has trickled down to those other suppliers as well. So this gives us the context and an understanding in terms of why diversity matters. And if you go into the next slide for me, please, Robert. And we can start to talk about, I guess, really how the HS2 work, in particular around EDI, how that's shaped. And there are 4 work streams that we have to cover across the whole of HS2. So the 4 work streams you see there are, first of all, the organization. So we talk about the organization as the HS2 Limited, so the company entity in itself. And that's really the sort of direct opportunity into HS2. So it's the sort of corporate side of HS2, if you like. And for that, we look at the people we recruit, the people we train, the whole life cycle journey of employment once people get into HS2 up to the point when they leave us. We also look at the sort of systems we have in place, policies, whether that's HR-based policies and other such policies that we have in place, the practices and the processes. Some of those processes will be around how we ensure governance, how we have continuous improvement in place, what are the sort of assurances we have in approving the work done by our suppliers. So it's the whole gamut of organizational function. And for that, HS2 has started from a position of being quite immature at the start of the program, but we've matured a great deal. And so we ensure that diversity is built in throughout the organizational structure end, in terms of how we recruit, how we retain people, but also some of the culture that we developed. So it's a more inclusive organization and a more inclusive culture. And how we're structured within the team, there is an EDI manager that looks after the organizational side of things around EDI. The other work stream is the supply chain, and this is an area that I look after specifically. And this is to do with all the activities, mainly within our procurement and tendering activities, working with our awarded suppliers who become part of our supply chain. Also looking at the contract management phase. How do we ensure that those suppliers who have been awarded contract with HS2 continue to deliver, and what reports are they providing to us, and what improvements are they making over the lifetime of their contract. So that's a real important area of work for us. So that forms another work stream. The last two are perhaps more to do with sort of communities from the view of when we look at where HS2 is going to impact in terms of geographical areas. So we're starting from London right up to the Midlands, and then from the Midlands in Birmingham right up to the northern cities, whether that's Manchester, Sheffield, etc. We start to see quite a diverse community impacted, whether they be impacted by way of the development of HS2 rail, so through their communities and the sort of noise disturbance that they would experience as part of building HS2. But equally, the greater impact and positive impact is really in terms of the job creation, because there will be local job creation as a result of HS2, many of which are still in the pipeline at the moment, and some of which have been delivered. And so we look to see where there are negative impacts, either because people also have to move from where they are to make room for the development of HS2, to ensure that we mitigate that and we provide them with either a better relocation and housing and land provision than what they currently have. And there are mechanisms in place to ensure that we do that. And so communities are a really important part of that, how we engage, how we communicate, and how we consult with community members. Because it's important that they feel involved as part of HS2, and that the whole development of HS2 and construction is not done to them without their involvement. It's about their involvement. And then the design and operation is the last work stream, and that's important from the point of view that this is really ensuring that health and safety and EDI on a construction site mirror each other. So there is a good understanding of how you undertake health and safety assessments, how you do briefings, and how you ensure that colleagues' safety comes first. And if you're doing that in tangent with diversity, then you've got a more inclusive site. There's no need to separate diversity from that, and it's just making sure that your site briefings are all part and parcel of the same things. The other component to design and operation is the inclusive design element. So an example of that would be where we're looking to construct stations like the Euston station, for example. There's been lots of requirements set in place so that we go through what we call the REBA stages of design. This is Royal Institute of Building and Architecture. It's a design process by which you ensure that the design you end up with is fit for purpose and can go into construction. And so as part of inclusive design, we think about access needs of passengers, access need of the amenities in the station, and for staff who will eventually be working there. And we make sure those things are factored in for the very beginning so that we don't have to retrofit anything at the very end. So design and operation is very key for us as well. So those are the 4 work streams that we cover across HS2. Next slide, please. And so having covered that, what does good look like? What are the challenges that we have, and what is it we need to do about them? So we recognize, even at the outset of the HS2 program, that there is across the country, across Britain, there is an engineering challenge. And what we mean by that is, when we look at cross engineering, it hasn't become, particularly civil engineering, it's not become an area that easily attracts young talent. And when I talk about young talent, those are sort of entry level apprenticeship programs, graduates, etc. And that's because when you look, and we have done this many times, we ask young people who perhaps are primary, secondary school, college age, what they want to do as a profession. Of those that are even interested in engineering and technology, they want to go into the IT sector. They want to work for the likes of Google's, etc. Civil engineering is less appealing. The image is that it's male dominated. So if you're a female, that's unattractive. The other image is that it's very hands-on, very manual. And in this day and age, there is an image management on the sort of IT side, which is more appealing to young people. So we recognize that challenge. And so the need to, if you like, nurture the attraction piece around engineering and do much more outreach work with communities, primary and secondary school, the teachers, and other sector partners is quite key for us. And we've got, as part of our aim throughout the program, to create 22,000 jobs within our construction partners. And when we talk about construction partners of the awarded contracts, there is a core part of that that's to do with civil engineering roles. So those who are going to lay down the tracks, the tunneling, the station build, etc. So even in that space alone, across all the sort of construction, there are 22,000 jobs, which is a huge amount of pipeline. Then we look at the sort of challenge we have to close the gap. Annually, there are 59,000 engineering graduates and technicians where there's a shortfall. So we can really never get enough in terms of entry level people coming into the sector. So there is always a challenge to go out there and make sure we reach as much as possible to close that gap. Then we look at the challenge in terms of the limited number of women coming into the sector. You know, it's something which continues to be difficult for us to sort of bridge the gap. 1 in 10 engineers are women, and those 16% are undergraduates. And when you look at the male-dominated sector we work in, it's not necessarily very attractive for lots of women to say they want to come in and work for this sector. The good news, what are we doing about this, and why is this important in the context of the challenge that we have? Well, one of the things we start to look at is strengthen our apprenticeship program. You know, since 2017, we've been running an apprenticeship program, which is a 2-year-long program and covers various functions and directorate across HS2. You know, so you can start from being a project manager, or you work in human resources, to finance, or perhaps work for rail systems in core engineering. So there's all different components you can do. And I will urge you to look at the HS2 website, www.hs2.org.uk/future talent. And that in itself gives you an understanding of what we have on offer. Of the apprenticeships we've had, over 50% of our intake through the program has been females. So we have a heavy and a high number of female intake as part of our apprenticeship program, which is really encouraging. And at the moment, we have application that's open and due to close by February for our intake of apprentices, and that happens annually. There is a graduate program, perhaps less prominent than the apprenticeship program, and simply because it's the sector we work in. More people go through a sort of apprenticeship route than they do go through a graduate route, sorry, into the sector. And just to share with you very quickly in terms of what the professional intake looks like. So other than the graduate and apprenticeship intake, we've got a graduate level attraction. So we've set ourselves a challenge. And we know in terms of our workforce, we always need to be a lot more representative of the groups we work with. And so when we started overall, 36% of females within the HS2 direct workforce are female. So all the recruitment we do across the board, we started from 36% last year. Currently and to date, as we speak, we're at 38% of female representation. Now that may not seem a huge change and drive, but we also have to remember that we lose people throughout the months and the years ahead. And so people leave the organization for other companies. So there's been some progress made there in terms of that. When we look at our supply chain overall, there is 26% representation of female across that population. So of our supply chain population. When we look at sort of Black and ethnic minority in terms of direct intake, we did start from last year in terms of the HS2 workforce, so the direct HS2 limited workforce at 19%. And we're now at 21%. So there's been an increase to 21% in the current year. For our supply chain, they're at 15% in terms of BAME representation. You know, from the starting position where they were at, this is a massive improvement. The area that remains a challenge, or one of the biggest challenges strategically for us, is around disability. At best, we're at 3%, and we need to improve on that. And with our supply chain, they're at 6% representation around disability. I think for various reasons, which we recognize why there's a challenge, is because one, people find it hard to have the conversation around hidden disability. So they consider visible disability, somebody in a wheelchair, somebody with other physical impairments. But when it comes to the sort of hidden disability, mental health, etc., it's a lot more challenging. And so there's a lot more to not only educate people, but to provide the tools around this area. If you go to the next slide, please, and I can talk a bit in terms of what we're doing and how we measure and report success. What you see in the next slide is it's a 5-year development program, a model. And what this helps us to do is really to be able to have an approach that shows clearly how we develop and we make a difference around equality diversity across HS2. So if we go down the first column there, it says year 2015. And that was quite a critical point. It's a year before I joined HS2. But what we've done at that point is develop the 5-year EDI strategy. And part of that, then we set ourselves sort of a progress timeline. So it was really about understanding what the current state is. You know, what's going on at HS2 and what's going on within the sector, and what are the challenges we have around equality, diversity, and inclusion, and what is it we need to do over the next 5 years to close that gap and address those barriers. So that was what we did initially, to understand what the current state is. And as you go down there, the first thing when we started to do is to engage. We needed to engage with our stakeholders, those internal to HS2 and those external to HS2. And once we started to engage with them, we then took the right actions and set out a plan. Yeah, so that plan was, what are we going to do going forward? And you can see there in column 2, which says 2016 to 2019, we've set out what we did next. And that's really to develop our understanding. And part of that developing understanding is really to say, right, we know what's going on. What we now need to do is to map out how we get agreement from our senior leaders, how we get agreement for those we work with, and how we start to make some changes to the way we work. Changes in breaking down the barriers, changes in perception, and changes to getting an outcome. And we started to measure that. So that's what we did in that period. We started to measure where there were progress, and we identified where there were still challenges and what we're going to do going forward. But what was starting to happen is that we then started to really be an exemplar. You know, lots of people talk about HS2 and the great work we're doing in the supply chain, but other areas, which has helped really to encourage our sector partners that this is the right way to go. So some of the benchmarking we're doing with our sector partners with Highways England, Network Rail, TfL, Transport for London, has been shared and continues to be shared. And so once you're starting to share those practices, you start to innovate. You know, people look to you to be the innovators and to lead in that sector. And so this in itself has formed our sort of, if you like, development program that we're taking forward. Going into 2021, another 5-year plan. But there are key lessons learned in that period. And one of the things I want to share, just to give you an example of what are the key outcomes, we've got an externally verified standard. So through Clear Assured, which is an accreditation, it's an external accreditation which follows a format of an audit. And it shows us really what is HS2 doing across its workforce to achieve a standard that others can follow. And part of this accreditation with Clear Assured is that we've got a gold standard. So when we look at how we attract people, how we promote talent, how we retain talent, and what sort of learning and development is in place, this is really good and encouraging for us. We're now working towards a platinum status in the Clear Assured standard. So that's just one example to share with you in terms of what we've done. And Robert, if we go to the final slide, which really takes us on a round trip really to look at the final part, which is the challenges for the year ahead. And what you have in this final slide is really our current objectives up till the end of this financial year, so 31st of March 2021. I've grouped it into 6 areas because I want to focus on these areas because they're perhaps the most strategic for us. And it doesn't mean that we've not done anything else outside of these areas. It just means that these are the ones that will be on the radar for our senior leadership team and for our executive team and certainly for the board. And so for the last 3 years now, we've been working on the transport sector EDI benchmark standard. And so the transport sector, as I mentioned earlier, is the Transport for London, TfL, Highways England, us HS2, and Network Rail. And we are also including other transport sectors eventually. But the idea of this is that we've had a playback event, as we call it, every year. So towards the end of every year in December, we look at the data and we tell the story about how we're developing this standard around the benchmark. And so the benchmark really speaks of what does the sector looks like as transport sector partners? What are we doing with our suppliers? How diverse are they? What are the challenges they have around diversity? And what improvements can we make? And so we want to arrive at a position in a year or 2 time where we can show what the sector looks like, how representative is the sector, and that will become the sort of benchmark standard that others can look at and follow. And so it's really a leadership piece for us, and I think it's encouraging that we're able to do that. When we start to look at the sort of Clear Assured accreditation that I mentioned, we've also had those in our supply chain who are working towards their own accreditation, be that accreditation a Clear Assured standard or another type of standard. It's encouraging that we're in a position where it's not about saying how good you are, it's actually being able to be tested to prove how good you are. And so these are quantifiable, and these accreditation means that there are clear measures and standard that is shown so that we know how good as an organization and a supplier you are around diversity. The third one is the pay gap reduction. So currently HS2 is 25% pay gap between male and female. So if you were to take the average women across the organization at any grade, and you were to look on the average what their pay is, and you do the same with men across the organization and you were to line them up, we have a 25% pay gap. So the challenge is by 31st of March this year, we have to report on that pay gap and say how much we've made a difference to reducing that 25%. And that's something that our senior leaders and certainly the board is keen to reduce the gap on. We would also report on the disability pay gap and also the ethnicity pay gap for the first time. And so that will be challenging. And of course, those of you who are in the sector will hear of our reports come 31st of March. The other three, so EDI mandatory training, for example, is one area that we've always looked to make sure that across the organization, there is a standard by which anybody can log on and do key training. And this training really is to do with legal compliance, is to do with disability, but also is to do with recruitment, so a more inclusive recruitment method. And so all staff across HS2 will have to complete this by end of this year. And then what will happen consequently is then we do a refresher training year on year. But in the history of HS2, this is the first time we're doing a mandatory training. It doesn't mean we've not done other sorts of training on diversity. It's just we haven't mandated it for the first time. And it's important we do this because we want everybody to be on the same page and have an understanding around the diversity training. The other thing we offer as part of our objective this year is reverse mentoring. We've been doing reverse mentoring for the past 2 years. And what we found is every year, the demand for the numbers of people that want to participate is even higher. And so the rollout this year is that we've got a huge number of mentors and mentees that have been matched. So for those that don't know, as part of reverse mentoring, the mentees are the senior leaders in the organization, the senior leadership team or exec team. And the mentors themselves are those who are in the sort of middle management or below middle management. And the idea is that it's really to empower you and so that senior leaders understand the challenge of some of our diverse staff in navigating the organization. What are the barriers that's in place? What sort of challenge do they face on a day-to-day basis, on longer term basis? And it's proven really successful. Our CEO, Mark Thurston, had taken part in last year's one and will take part in this year's one as well. And I guess the sixth part of this, or the last one I want to cover around EDI objectives, is really around equality impact assessment. I called it equality analysis earlier on. It's interchangeable terms really, but in essence, it's a tool that we use, and it helps us identify at the outset what the potential impact might be if we were to develop a policy to make a key decision that impacts on groups, whether those groups are internal to the organization or external, and how then we mitigate any impact that may occur as a result. In all of this, as part of our objectives, it's important that we publish what we do. And one way we do that is we have an EDI annual report, which usually comes out in July each year. And as we speak, we're working through our one that will come out for the current year going forward. And within that report, you will see all the activities we do across EDI for HS2 and all the sort of metrics and measures and the impact of what we do. And I think for now, of course, I'll welcome questions, but for now, I'll leave it there because there's quite a lot to digest and it's a quick whistle tour given the time we have. So I'm open to any questions.
Excellent, thank you, Osita. Some great knowledge shared there, and it's great to see the mandatory training and all the the different elements you've put in place during your time at HS2. So thank you very much for sharing. What I'll do is I'll move on to some of the questions that we've had in. We've had a lot of lovely comments to say thank you for sharing. The first one we have is from Catherine, who has said, what one piece of advice would you give someone looking to drive positive EDI change in their organisation?
Wow, that's a good question. One positive advice. I think the first thing to do is to understand within your organization, if you're going to make such a change, is to know who are your allies and who are your gatekeepers. So that initial understanding is key, because without knowing that, you will start from a position of wanting to make change to those who are not ready for the change, and also those who are not aligned with you in making that change. So when I talk about allies, it's important to recognize that you need allies at senior level. So whether those be directors in key areas, you may be the chief exec, or you might be part of your senior leadership or executive team. So there may be individuals or there may be collective allies that you need to align with. And you need to be very clear to them what change you want to make and how they can support you to make those changes. Because ultimately, those allies can help have the conversation with the gatekeepers, those who are the blockers, who are not open to the conversation, who are not open to the change, and would help you to sort of win over their hearts and minds as part of the conversation. I hope that's helped.
No, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, it's definitely good to have the support and the allies going forward. Michelle has asked, how are you measuring the impact you're having across the different areas within the work stream?
That's a good question. So we have several measures in place. So we've developed a suite of key performance indicators. And some of those key performance indicators will look at things, for example, in terms of the number of EDI training that our supply chain has completed within the last 6 months, for example. The number of suppliers that have achieved an accreditation. And it doesn't have to be a clear assured, it could be a number of different accreditation they've chosen. The number of our suppliers that perhaps have, is aligned or close to the sort of standard of workforce diversity that HS2 has. So if they're more representative. So there are key performance indicators that will look at those areas. But what I do currently as well is, and for the last 3 years we've been doing this, is really be very clear on our measures and our reporting requirements. So every 6 months, we ask our suppliers to submit reports which are detailed to show us what they're doing to deliver around their workforce diversity, their recruitment, their training, how much money they're spending with minority-owned businesses, what they're doing to open up their supply chain to those businesses, and their accreditation. So there's a number of detailed reports we ask our suppliers, and we scrutinize those reports, and where there are gaps or problems, we will sit down with our suppliers and work through those. The other thing we do is we have measures in place on a monthly basis. So through our steering group, we hold people to account. So if in terms of governance structures, we have that in place. And we ask that discussions around diversity takes place at the most senior level. So whether that's be the HR People's Panel, which meets regularly, diversity is discussed there in terms of performance. So there are key measures we have in place to enable that to happen. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So Tim has asked, what is the best example of EDI performance and performance improvement you have seen in working with the supply chain?
The best example of performance improvements. I think what I've seen certainly from our main work civils suppliers has been really impressive. And what they've done in essence is they've taken ownership from the outset. So it's not been an afterthought or reactive approach to diversity. What they've said is at the start of the contract, we will get somebody in to manage this area of work. That person would engage, report, and be proactive in seeking to make a difference. And so what we've had from the outset is a really good relationship whereby they anticipate what's needed, they look at the work ahead, and they engage with us in that area, and we sit down and work through it. So an example would be, we've done things with EKJV, FiveYear as part of a joint venture. And from the outset, they've been very clear that they wanted to achieve their accreditation within 6 months of the contract. And they set out to do that, and they did exactly just that. And we worked with them on that. They were also very clear that they wanted to use things like blind auditioning and look at how job descriptions are put together that were subjective and discriminatory. And they wanted to remove some of those things to make it more objective. They also wanted to look at their recruitment process and ensure that the conversion rates from application, shortlist, interview to hire is a lot more inclusive. And we worked with them to make sure that that took place and that was addressed. So there is really some good example, and they're not alone in that. There are others in our main work civils who have done the same. So that early engagement and putting resources in place and being proactive is really the key to making it happen.
Excellent. There's some great examples. Thank you. And Tim, I hope that helps you. James has asked, well, first started off saying thanks for the great presentation. And then he's asked, how scalable is the accreditation scheme you used to smaller companies or those with a smaller budget?
It's a good question, actually. So some of the accreditation can be several thousands of pounds to actually be an accredited body, if you like. So one of the things we do is, whilst we are engaging with our tier one, most of whom are large companies or part of a large joint venture, we then recognize that our tier one suppliers will subcontract some of the work out to smaller suppliers. And some of those smaller suppliers might be SMEs, small, medium enterprises. And so it has to be proportionate. We would not expect a small business of 25, which is a small business in itself, to be able to get something like a clear assured standard, or to have attained a national equality standard, which is run by EY. But we may ask them, for example, to, I don't know, look at if they've got a website, to look at how accessible their website might be. So we always think about how proportionate, based on the size of the organization, the resource they have, to be able to deliver the accreditation we want and expect of them. And that's something we can discuss before they go ahead and identify which accreditation they want to go for.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm picking up on a couple of questions, and it is linked to the current challenges that we have in the world at the minute. Aaron, for example, has asked, have the current impacts had any effects on HS2's EDI objectives and initiatives?
I imagine the impact would be the COVID situation, or is it other impacts? Yeah. So in terms of what we're doing, it has had an impact, and that's from the outset. I would say yes, it has had an impact. One of the things we found is that there are many more staff working from home, and so when you start to think about people's well-being, mental health, work-life balance, all of those things have been compromised at some point because of the COVID situation. And we recognize that people working from home, some are lone parents, some may have housing situation that doesn't allow them to work comfortably from home because they don't have the resources to work from home. They're in a shared accommodation with other people because they've got a room. And so one of the things we started to do is a survey from the outset and allow line managers to talk directly to their staff outside of the survey. So it's about day-to-day engagement and week-by-week engagement, checking with your team members, how are they doing? And not just asking how they're doing and accepting that when somebody says they're okay, that they're okay. It's actually making sure that they're okay. So coffee breaks, virtual ones, they're calling. Ensuring that people take regular breaks in between meetings. They're not back to back. Ensuring that if somebody doesn't want to work 9 till 5, that it's okay not to do so. And they need to take a break because they've got other arrangements they need to make. So that flexible working arrangements we still apply where people are working virtually and from home. What is revealed to us, and we've been working through the feedback we've gotten from staff as a result of this lockdown and working under the sort of COVID-19 situation, is that people felt reassured and supported because we're always asking and understanding how we can adjust their work. And where we're seeing people struggle is where there's been other family impact. So health reasons, those who've had COVID in the family, children who are working from home because they're not able to be in school. And so that creates additional pressure for staff themselves when they're working from home. And so continuing to have the conversation, continuing to get feedback and addressing those things, and offering an option where people can come into the office. 3 months into the lockdown from March last year, we were able to offer that as an option because we know clearly the environment of being at home on time all the time is really difficult. So people can go into the office and work from the office should they wish. Nobody's mandated to do that. So I think all of those interventions and mechanisms have helped.
Yeah, excellent answer. I think people are I pick up on the keywords you kind of mentioned there. The flexibility, putting the people first is very important at these times.
Yes.
David has asked, what has been your single toughest challenge when it comes to rolling out an EDI strategy?
Oh, good question there. Single toughest challenge would be making the business case why you need to have an EDI strategy. And you have to make that business case clear. The clarity of it is so important because those that sits outside of the people function, HR, etc., and who are engineers, who are project managers, who are in finance, etc., they would not get it. They would not understand the people dimension. They think quite different because of the work they do. And so you've got to have a compelling business case. Yes, diversity is something critical, but why do we need it? They may not see it as critical in the same way that you do. So what you've got to be able to do is make sure that it links in to the corporate strategy. So it's not just an EDI strategy that's been created because you need to be legally compliant and you need to look at other areas, but it has to really link into the corporate objectives and the strategy. And so if you're able to sit down with whoever is developing the corporate strategy from the outset and make sure you're hitting the right notes. So if, for example, there is a corporate focus in our example around making sure that we demonstrate value for money in part of our construction contract, because that's going to be key for us. We can't go to the government and ask for more money. Then you have to demonstrate how your area, particularly around equality, diversity, and inclusion, is not expensive and therefore is not a high cost area. What is it you can deliver and what is it you can provide that's scalable, cost effective? That would be good for finance to know and understand. So you really need to make a compelling business case and present that in a way very clear to the senior leaders and to the exec that makes them feel reassured that you're speaking the same language and that is very much aligned to their corporate objectives.
Yeah, excellent. And it kind of links into one of your previous answers about getting that support from your senior management. And as you say, that's done by a very strong business case outlining what you're trying to do. And I think you mentioned that you started 2016. So you've definitely
Yes.
done a great job over the last 5 years. So well done on that. Ram has mentioned some of the other challenges that have taken place over the summer in America, especially with the Black Lives Matter. Has that sped up the EDI process at all?
Yeah, it's a good question, because what it definitely has sped it up, and what we found since that summer with George Floyd killing is that everybody wants to have a conversation, and everyone wants to talk about race specifically. So where you'll typically get avoidance on the race issue, there is more willingness to talk about it. But the willingness to talk about it doesn't mean there's an understanding about race. So when colleagues across the organization who are of BAME background start to talk about their experience and the challenges that they've faced, the barriers in place, how they've been treated, it's only then that some people start to recognize that there is a problem around race. It's often previous to that, others in the organization likes to dismiss, assume that there's a level playing field, and that the people's experience are not necessarily the reality. And so there is a challenge across the organization and with some of our sector partners that you need to go beyond the conversation, and you need to be proactive around race. So our CEO has done a really good job in this area, and one of the things he's done is we've mandated all our senior leaders to read a book called "I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race." And then our chief exec has shared his experience and understanding having read that book. And so we've developed through our staff network a book club. So they're challenged to read a book around race or other aspects and share what they're going to do organizationally around that area. So I think that's really a good steer. So there are many things you can introduce and do about it. But I think the conversation has to be a starter, but the action is the more important element, part of it.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. And what? Sorry, what did you say that book was? Someone's just asked. I'm no longer
talking to white people about race. I'll give you the author. Could have the author number. Just bear with me.
Not a problem. In the meantime, I'll just read out some of the lovely comments people are saying. Thank you for your answers to the questions. They're very grateful. Angela's just said that is a good idea about introducing this as a book club. Ruby has jumped in, I don't know, maybe on the old Google skills, and said, "Why am I no longer talking to white people about race?" by Rennie Edu Lodge.
That's correct. Yeah, Rennie Edu Lodge. It's a double barrel.
There we go. So thank you, Osita, and thank you, Ruby, as well, for helping us out there. I've got a question here, and I'm conscious of time as well, but Shamima has asked, did you use a particular change model when rolling out EDI to a more mature state? Sorry,
repeat the question again. Did you use a
particular change model when rolling out EDI to a more mature state?
No, it was one that it was in discussion. So we did this as part of an away day. You know, we sat down as the EDI team with Matt Lomas to develop this and thinking, what is it we want and what should it look like? But we wanted a development model that was simple to understand, and wasn't necessarily about the audience, as in the staff or the stakeholders. It was more for us as the EDI experts to be able to use it for making the change. So that development model was one we can refer to, and then say, right, where are we? Have we done the engagement? Have we done the change? Have we innovated? Of course, there are detailed plan that sits behind that model. So, you know, once we look at sort of a yearly objective plan, we are able to sort of untangle that. So there wasn't necessarily a specific change model that we used. It was one that we developed ourselves that was fit for purpose.
Excellent, thank you. And Shamia. I hope that helps. Ruby has just posted that she's one of your colleagues and co-chair of the BAM network. So thank you, Ruby, for that. So I'm aware that time's coming up. So Osita, I'd personally like to say thank you for you giving up your time today and your knowledge and sharing some great ideas. It looks like a lot of people are going to go forward with the book club and put actions in place rather than talking about this. So thank you for your time again.
Thank you. Thank you all for the audience and the questions.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, and just echoing what Osita's just said, thank you everyone for joining us today and taking the time out, but also posing some great questions. I can see some lovely comments coming through. Thank you very much for the great presentation, Matthew said. So Osita, I'll send those through to you so you can
Brilliant.
see those.
Thank you so much.
We hope to see you at future APM webinars very soon. Bye for now.
Okay, bye-bye all.